We are talking today about public land, and in this one we will talk about different types of public land and how we use it. So your address standard for this lecture is Essential Understanding 5B.7, which deals with how human populations must design systems to protect areas of publicly owned land. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the difference between public and common land, identify the different types of public land in the United States, explain the ways in which public land is used in the United States, including responsible government offices, and predict problems associated with the loss of public land and propose solutions to these problems. So the first thing we have to do is talk about how we define public land. Recall that we have talked about the difference between a common area, common land, sometimes known as a commons, and public land. So a commons is an area that is unowned by anyone and is therefore available for use for the entire community. Public land, however, is land that is owned by the people of a country and is often held in trust for them by their government. So in this case, public land in the United States is owned by us, but it is managed by the several departments of the federal government. So when we look at public land in the United States, there are 6 basic kinds of public land. So we're going to talk about those 6 different kinds, and then we're going to talk about what governmental agency is responsible for them. So the first one is forests. So of course the forest is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and as of right now there are 154 national forests in the United States. The next is grasslands and rangelands. So right now there are 20 protected grasslands in the United States that are also managed by the Forest Service. And there are 770 million acres of rangelands in the United States that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Then we have wilderness. Wilderness areas account for 5% of all of the United States land area, with the majority of that 5% being found in Alaska. In fact, over half of Alaska's land area is dedicated to wilderness areas. Wilderness is land that is officially designated as an area where natural communities have not been disturbed by humans, and human activities are limited by law. Wilderness areas are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and they are kept in what is called the National Wilderness Preservation System. Next, you have wetlands. Wetlands are areas including estuaries, swamps, and other coastal ecosystems that are often sanctuaries for endangered species. Wetlands are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Then you have wildlife refuges. Wildlife refuges are a lot like wetlands, but they don't have to be a wet area. And these are areas that are protected and set aside for an endangered species because that is their habitat. Wildlife refuges as well are also managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Lastly, you have parklands. Parklands are tracts of land that don't necessarily fall cleanly into one of the above categories. Parklands may be areas of historic significance, cultural beauty, aesthetic beauty, cultural importance. Parklands may include a national forest or part of a protected river, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing is a forest or the whole thing is a river area. The parklands in the United States are managed by the National Park Service. So when we talk about how we use public lands, we have to define the regulations that are allowed in that particular area. So there are 3 ways that we regulate how we are able to use public land. So the first one is multiple use. Those are lands that are used for commercial and recreational enjoyment within regulations. So examples of public land that fall under the multiple use category are national forests, grasslands, and rangelands. Then there's moderately restricted use. Those are lands that can be used for recreational enjoyment, but often require permits for things such as camping, setting a campfire, or using a particular area of the land. The best example of a moderately restricted use land area is a national park. Lastly, we have the restricted use land, and those lands are set aside to be without human interference. In most cases, it is required to have a specialized permit issued by the governing department of the federal government to even be allowed to go into them. So examples of these include wetlands, wildlife preserves, and wilderness areas. In fact, the wilderness area is the most protected and regulated land in the United States. So in using public land, we also have to realize that they can be used for many different purposes. And the problems tend to come when those lands either are not managed properly or they are overused. Unfortunately, many departments of the federal government are underfunded, and they are often run by individuals or groups of individuals who focus largely on the commercial profit in those areas. So when we talk about problems existing with using public lands, again, we're talking about that overuse and that misuse. It's when people fall victim to that idea of the tragedy of the commons. The resource is there, everybody owns it, let's use it as much as we want. And we also have to worry about this degradation idea of where those areas are not allowed to remain pristine, they're not allowed to follow their natural course of biology. So there have been 3 basic laws that have kind of put into effect to try to deal with this problem. The first of these is the Wilderness Act. And the Wilderness Act allows the federal government to set aside land as wilderness and heavily restrict the way it can be used and who can use it. The second of these is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. These also come into play in a wilderness area because a lot of the areas that are set aside as wilderness also have these rivers that run through them. So the Wild and Scenic River Act is designed to prevent commercial industry from polluting or damaging a part of a protected river system. So we want that river system to stay as close to its original feature and its flow as possible. The last law that we've put into place for degradation is what's called the Anadromous Fish Conservation Act. An anadromous fish is any fish that lives in a marine habitat for the majority of their life, but they return to freshwater to reproduce. Best example of an anadromous fish is the salmon. So what the Anadromous Fish Conservation Act law does is it requires the habitats of these fish to be maintained and protected, especially if they are in a wilderness area. So when we talk about using public land, really the big thing that comes into play that really is overused and degraded very quickly are forests. So one of the primary reasons for this is that timber is a valuable resource, and it takes a long time for that resource to replenish itself. Forests are subject to what's called ecological succession, which is the process of moving from bare rock up to a climax community of trees. So there are 2 processes that make up ecological succession. Primary succession, which is when you have a pioneer species such as lichen, begins to process bare rock and turn it into soil. So this particular diagram here shows you what happens in primary succession. So you have these pioneer species, which are lichen, small annual plants, and grasses that come in and they take an area that was once bare rock and they go through the weathering process, the deposition process to produce viable soil that eventually ends up in your climax community of particular kinds of trees. So you're looking at shade-tolerant trees there in primary succession. Secondary succession takes place if the original community has been destroyed, particularly if it's been destroyed by fire, it's been destroyed by clear cutting. The big thing to notice is that the soil has to remain intact. So you see here we have a fire occurring, but the soil is still there. So instead of having those lichen come in, we can kind of start with those annual plants that start rebuilding the soil, making it healthier. Then we move through the grasses, into the shrubs, and we move into the mature climax community at the very end. Another way that we have an issue here is the way that forest ecosystems are managed. So while most of us think that a forest fire is a bad thing, they are periodically necessary to keep the forest ecosystem healthy. Certain types of fires can remove brush, leaf litter, dead trees, while helping specially adapted seeds to germinate. And there's also a very big boom in biodiversity after a forest fire occurs. And there are three basic types of forest fire. So those three types of forest fire are shown here on the left side of your screen. The first one is what's called a ground fire. Ground fires tend to occur when you have peat or some kind of burning material that burrows into the soil. The fire actually takes place underneath the soil. They're very difficult to find, and sometimes they smolder, so they can stay there for a very long time and then pop up later. The second type is a surface fire. Surface fires occur literally on the surface of the forest floor, and that tends to burn leaf litter, dead branches, other flammable material as it naturally accumulates. Surface fires are really the kinds of fires that are good for an ecosystem because it helps to remove a lot of this brush. The last is a crown fire. Crown fires are the most destructive because they destroy the entire tree, and they move from one tree to another in those upper levels of the forest canopy. In order to kind of avoid those devastating crown fires, we can have what's called a prescribed burn. Those are managed by the Forest Service, and those function to reduce that amount of leaf litter that is going to encourage a fire to come later. We also have to worry about the way that health of a forest is managed dealing with harvesting timber. So there are several ways that we can harvest timber, and some of them are sustainable, some of them are not. So here in the first box, you see what's called clear cutting. And clear cutting is literally when all of the trees in a particular area are removed. They are cut out and taken away. It's the most economically feasible, most profitable, least sustainable. So the second one here that you have a little bit more sustainable is what's called strip cutting. It's very similar to clear cutting, except the trees are harvested in strips. So this allows for trees to grow back and mature, providing a harvest for future years. These bottom two here indicate different types of what's called selective cutting. That's where you choose specific types or specific ages of trees to be removed. So here on the left in picture 3, you have what's called shelter wood cutting. So you take the smaller trees while leaving taller trees behind. And the fourth one here at the very other side is what's called seed tree cutting. And when you do seed tree cutting, you remove some of the trees while still leaving enough trees behind that can replace the ones that were taken. So you specifically pick certain trees that are able to bear nut, to produce seeds, and replenish the trees that you have taken away. Double check over these objectives, make sure that you can do all of these, and review the lecture as necessary.